If you wanted to learn to surf, right? You want to learn how to surf. There are a number of places that would make total sense to go. You could go to California. You could go to Hawaii. You could go to Portugal. There's a great surfing area there on the coast. You could go to Australia, right? There's so many great places you could go. I wouldn't recommend Iowa. Now, just in case you are a little rusty on your geography, let me bring up a map of the U.S. and you'll see here that, yeah, Iowa is kind of like in the middle of the country and it has kind of a shortage of these things that I've kind of marked with the black arrows, a shortage of ocean, right? And that's going to make it a little harder to learn to surf. That's going to be a definite obstacle to overcome. You can do it. You can do it. I mean, I looked it up this week. There's a website, landlockedsurfing.com. You can learn to surf there, but it's going to be harder. Right? That makes perfect sense to us. If you want to learn to surf, go to some place where surfing is kind of obvious. You got oceans, you got waves, you got wind, all that kind of stuff. Similarly, if you want to learn to pray, there's some places you could go that would be obvious choices, places where prayer just seems to be more part of the culture, more natural, more logical thing to do. Maybe there are a lot of reminders to pray or whatever. There are some places you could go. There's one place I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go to learn to pray because it might be the hardest place on the planet to learn to pray. So let me bring up the map again to show you. Yeah, it's the USA. America is a tough place to learn to pray for a lot of reasons. Let me give you just a few. First, our culture trains us to look elsewhere for solutions when we've got a problem, and then to treat God as a last resort. That's part of our culture, and we get in that habit. Second, Americans are uncomfortable with the conditions that facilitate prayer, such as slowing down and silence, right? Those are things that we're not known for being great at as Americans. There are things that we're known for being great at around the world. You asking, one of them is getting it done, right? Ingenuity and finding a way to get things done. That's an Americanism, an American trait that's recognized around the world. Slowing down, being comfortable with silence. Those are not things that Americans are known for. As a matter of fact, there was a study done where they had people sit in a room by themselves, and they're just supposed to sit there, be quiet, be silent for 15 minutes. They were sitting on a chair that was wired up, and if they, for some reason couldn't handle the silence or whatever, and just needed something to distract their minds from the silence, they had a little button they could push, and it would actually send a little electric jolt through the chair. So your choice is be silent, be still for 15 minutes, or zap yourself. And it was amazing the number of people that zap themselves. We are not comfortable with that, and that makes it harder for us to learn how to pray. Another one, American culture is pretty impatient. We want it now, or already, or yesterday, or whatever. Right? We are an instant culture. And if you've got any experience with prayer, you know that prayer is not an instant kind of thing sometimes. Sometimes it is, but many times God allows us to pray with tremendous passion and diligence for 10 years, 12 years, right? American culture is impatient, and so that makes it harder for us to stick with it. American culture is kind of cynical. I may come back to this in a future part of this series that we're working on right now. But American culture is cynical, and faith and prayer and hope, those don't always go together, play nicely together, do they? Plus, there's one other thing that we'll talk about a little bit later that makes it difficult to learn to pray in America. But since I don't assume that most of us are going to move to wherever it would be that we might be more supportive of our prayer learning, let me talk about a couple of things that we just need to keep in mind that might help us as we work at learning to pray. Number one, we're Americans and therefore heavily influenced by our culture. So if you want to pray, you just need to recognize that you're going to need to learn to act counterculturally and perhaps counterintuitively. There'll be things that, as you're learning to pray, they're not going to feel comfortable. Maybe even more uncomfortable than getting zapped. And so just recognize that this isn't meant to be easy. The fact that it's not easy, or you have a hard time praying or sticking with prayer or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it wrong. It does, right? It means that you're learning to do it in a culture that isn't very supportive. And so you're going to have to do some things that might be kind of countercultural, maybe counterintuitive. And second, because this is something that's not going to come real easily probably for most of us, we need to learn to be patient with ourselves. We need to choose to be patient with ourselves. As Steve Cuss says, be as kind to yourself as Jesus is when you fail. All right, now, before we get into the next part, question for you. You got a choice. Would you prefer to be someone who's independent? Like you can decide and you can do, right? Independent. Interdependent. That's where you can do it and you can decide with others, right? And do with others. Or dependent. You are dependent on someone else. They're either going to do or they're going to decide and you're going to rely on them. Would you prefer to be independent, interdependent, or dependent? Now, we're doing this over the video here, and if we were at live chat, you could write your answer in there, and I would encourage you to do that. Or you could send me an email and let me know if you're doing this like via YouTube or whatever. But I'm going to go way out on a limb, and I'm going to guess that almost every one of us has the same answer to that question. We prefer to be independent. Don't we? To be able to make the choice ourselves, to do the thing ourselves, we prefer to be independent. American culture, friends, prizes independence and it rewards those who have it. This is something that I think there's a couple reasons we love independence, but one of them is our culture prizes it. This is another thing that's a challenge for us if we're going to learn to pray. So, we're Americans. Learning to pray in America, in a place that may be the most challenging place on the planet to learn to pray. But we're not just American, we're human. I want to really focus on this part. We're human. Because we're human, there are lots of incredible and wonderful benefits of being human, right? But there's a couple massive implications that we need to look at that are going to affect especially this whole prayer thing that we're talking about in this particular series. So number one, of two things I want to talk about that it means to be human. Number one, we're dependent on God. We are dependent on God. Jesus modeled this for us last week in part one. We talked about Jesus modeled for us being your real self and talking about your real life when you're talking with God. Jesus also modeled for us what it's like to be dependent. He was fully human and yet fully dependent on God. This is John chapter 5, verse 19. Jesus replied, talking to the crowd, "Truly I tell you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son likewise does these things." This is seems really weird to us, right? Jesus is God. He's God. He can do anything, right? There's nothing beyond his reach except for things that are outside of his character. And he says to us, the Son does nothing on his own. He's not able to do anything on his own, only what he sees the Father doing. Now, you might hear that and go, wow, that's really dependent. Is that a one-time thing Jesus said? This was kind of a one-off. Maybe we translated it wrong. Maybe we misunderstood. Well, this is verse 30, same chapter. "I can do nothing on my own," Jesus said. "I judge only as I hear from my Father, and my judgment is just because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the one who sent me." No, sounds like he's saying, I'm completely dependent on the Father, in this case for judgment, to know how to view things. He's talking about perspective and judgment on things. I know I had the right view of things because I heard it from my Father. John 8, verse 28, Jesus said to them, "When you lift up the Son of Man, when you put him up there on the cross, then you'll know that I am he and that I do nothing on my own. But just as the Father taught me, I say these things. The one who sent me is with me. He's not left me alone because I always do what pleases him." I am dependent upon God, Jesus says. I'm dependent upon God to know what he wants done. And then I never go off and act on my own. I do with him what he wants done. John chapter 12, verse 49. "For I have not spoken on my own, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a command to say everything I've said." So I know that his command is eternal life. So the things that I speak just as the Father has told me. Just I am dependent on God for knowing what to tell you. John 14:10, don't you believe that I am the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak to you, I do not speak on my own. The Father who lives in me does his works. There's this dependence thing that's going on there. Jesus was fully human and fully dependent on God. And he refused to live any other way. He absolutely refused to live life independently of his Father, to make up his own mind, like this is what I'm going to do, and then go off and do it all on his own. He refused to do that. Satan tempted Jesus to do that. Satan tempted Jesus to be independent, to at one particular time to use his powers to get out of a situation that God had led Jesus to be in. This is Matthew chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. So God, the Father, through the Spirit, leads Jesus to go to a certain place for a specific reason. He's going to get tempted. After he'd been fasted 40 days, 40 nights, he was hungry. Then the tempter approached him and said, if you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. And he answered, it's written, man must not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus is like, no. I am not going to take matters into my own hand and make my own bread. I'm not doing that. I am not doing that. The Father led me here through the Spirit. I'm staying here, and I'm staying in the situation until he says otherwise. Friends, dependence on God, and for that matter, interdependence on people, that's not part of the curse. That's not something that happened because everything went wrong, when Adam and Eve sinned, and so many things went wrong. And our life is so much more difficult. And our world is so broken because of that curse, because of that sin. Dependence on God isn't part of that. There's no sin there. And yet he was dependent on God. You can see the same thing in Adam's life. Being dependent on God is a good thing. It's a great thing. Fully human. Human at its very, very best includes unhindered relationship with God and dependence on God. Which leads to a question then, right? Why do we resist both dependence on God and interdependence on people? I mean, why are we so resistant if it's such a good thing? If it was there in the Garden of Eden, and if it's there in Jesus' life, and he didn't seem to balk at it at all, except instead he almost seemed to brag about it, right? They're like, this was a good thing. If it's so good, why do we resist? The old heart. I think our old heart, the old nature, that the sinful, broken nature that, because of the fall, the old heart, and our culture. Our culture prizes independence. Well, that's interesting, you might think. Okay, Andy, that's interesting. Maybe I've thought about that, maybe I haven't. But does it really matter? Does it really matter that we resist being dependent on God? Wow. The answer to that question, which is a great question, could be an entire sermon series, but instead of answering it, I'm only going to make a couple observations on the problem of independence or autonomy, and let you ponder that question on your own. Does it really matter that we resist being dependent on God? Is that really a big deal? Or better yet, instead of answering it on your own, I'd encourage you to talk it over with some folks that you're in Christian community with and discuss it together with them. Here are my two observations to the question of, does it really matter? Is that a big deal? It's a big enough of an issue that Satan tempted Jesus with it. Satan must have thought it was going to help him defeat God in some amazing way. So that tells me something. Second, it has the power, this resistance to depending on God, it has the power to infect everything, even prayer. You think about it, there's a version of praying that's all about trying to get God to do something for us so that we'll no longer feel dependent or helpless. Right? I mean, a number of our prayers, when you really look at it, it's okay to pray about a lot of this stuff, but really when you look at what drives some of our prayers, it's God, I don't want to be in this situation anymore because when I do, I feel helpless. I feel dependent and I don't like that. So God, get me into a situation where I'm not in touch with that feeling anymore. I don't sense that in my life. This thing can infect everything, including our prayers. So we're human. It means we're dependent on God. Number two, it means we're helpless in many ways. Oh, and don't we hate the feeling of helplessness? Several years ago, there were 2 carloads of college students headed to Cedar Point for the day. Mara was driving one of the cars. I was riding with her, and a friend of ours was driving the other car. There were 4 of us in each of the cars, and we're driving, 8 of us headed to Cedar Point. Looking forward to a great day. Come around a bend or hill or what, I don't really remember, but what I do remember is Mara hit a possum with her little Toyota Corolla. Wasn't a big deal. It led to a couple jokes about the possum would now be playing possum and all that kind of stuff. But just a few miles down the road, we heard this loud clunk in the back of the little Toyota Corolla. We pulled off to the side of the road and we got out. And, I don't know a lot about cars, so I get out, and I just kind of walk around the car. When I get around to the back corner, I notice that the wheel, the tire, is not touching the ground. It's not touching the ground at all. No, something has broken off in there, and that wheel is jammed completely up inside of the wheel well. It's several inches off of the road. And so we're literally, we've got a car now that only has 3 wheels, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. The other one is like just completely jammed up in there. We didn't realize it, but Mara must have hit the possum of doom, in one final act of defiance. As he's dying, he reached up and grabbed and broke our axle or something. I don't know what it was, but he got us good. And so now I'll never forget this. I look at Mara and I'm like, I have no idea what you do next, but I know this is like really, really bad. And so I had this sense like, is this the point at which we just take the car and we just like push it off of a cliff somewhere and hope nobody notices? Because I'm pretty sure as I'm looking at it, there's no fix to this. This isn't like a flat tire. This is like tire is gone. You can hardly see it up there. So we just push this car off the cliff. There's no fixing to this. And right, the other car stopped, and we chatted through what we were going to do, and we remembered back a little ways. There was a village, and so we piled back in, the 4 of us piled back into that car and sat on the opposite side as much as we could. And we drove it with 3 wheels back into that town until we found a repair shop, I'm sure it was extremely comical when we got there, the mechanic could see, we're all on the one side of the car trying to keep it from tipping on the side that has no wheel. When it comes to cars, I'm helpless. That reaction I had that day is not a whole lot different now when something goes wrong. When something's wrong with my car, I'm like, is this the end? We just push it off a cliff? Because when it comes to cars, I'm helpless. I could change a tire. I can change the oil. I can add some windshield washer fluid, and I can probably do one other thing, and that's about it. I'm helpless, and I hate that feeling of helpless. And my anxiety kicks in, and I just start struggling. I start, thinking. And I'm not probably completely rational, as you can tell, because I'm thinking, let's just push the car off the cliff. And it's not just me. I was reading this book on prayer by Paul Miller, and he wrote this. He says, little children are good at helplessness. It's what they do best. But as adults, we soon forget how important helplessness is. I, for one, am allergic to helplessness. I don't like it. I want a plan. I want an idea or maybe a friend to listen to my problem. That's how I instinctively approach everything because I'm confident in my own abilities. We don't like this feeling of helplessness, and that leads to a question. Why? Why do we hate helplessness? Despise, loathe entirely, right? Why do we hate helplessness so much? Well, I hate helplessness because I hate the feeling of helplessness. Well, that's true, but why? Why? Well, there's probably a number of things that our pride may be part of it, but I think one of the big reasons why we hate helplessness is because we probably equate it with hopelessness. Like if I'm helpless, then I'm hopeless, right? If I'm helpless, there's nothing that I can do. And if there's nothing I can do, then there's nothing that can be done. Therefore, I am hopeless. But let's pause and examine that for a minute. Is that all true? Does helplessness equal hopelessness for the Jesus follower? Is that true? And no, helpless does not equal hopeless for the Jesus follower. Luke chapter 18, verse 1. Jesus told them a parable on the need for them to pray always and not give up. Here's the parable. There was a judge in a certain town who didn't fear God or respect people, and a widow in that town kept coming to him saying, "Give me justice against my adversary." For a while he was unwilling, but he later said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or respect people, yet because this widow keeps pestering me, I will give her justice so that she doesn't wear me out by her persistent coming." Then the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. Will not God grant justice to his elect who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay helping them? I tell you that he will swiftly grant them justice. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" Now, the main point of this parable was persist in praying. He said it right there at the beginning, right? He told them a parable on the need for them to pray always and not give up. That's the main point. But the widow's helplessness is obvious. She knows she's helpless. She's got this adversary. I don't know what the guy was doing, but somebody is being nasty to her. Maybe trying to take advantage of her, whatever, trying to kick her out, whatever. I don't know. But she is helpless. She's got an adversary that's more powerful than her. She can't, right? She can't kick him. She can't, gum him to death. She can't hit him with her cane. She's helpless. She knows it. And she knows, though, that there's somebody who can help, this judge. So she knows she's helpless, but she is not hopeless. She's not hopeless. She's full of hope. She knows there's a guy, this judge, who, if properly motivated, can help her. She's helpless, but not hopeless. And so what does she do? She goes to the judge and asks for help. Repeatedly. And God says to you and to me, she is your example. Jesus' followers are helpless and hopeful. When they ask, Jesus says to us, "Go to me. When you have a need, come to me and ask." You're helpless, yes, but hopeless, no. Be hopeful. Instead, he goes so far as saying, be hopeful. So, how do we react to our helplessness? Well, we got three options. Option one, right? We are helpless, but we can respond to it three different ways. Option one, we could pretend that we're not helpless. Right? We could pretend that we're not. Just ignore it. Work hard. Try to cover up. So we're helpless. We can't fix it. Like you're trying to get your friend or your child to change their mind on something, and you really are helpless to change someone else's mind. But we can pretend. You can pretend you're not. You can go to them and you do this number. And you just keep telling them what you want them to do, and when they don't do it, then you can go to them again and you can pretend that you're not helpless. Right? You can rely on your words and keep pressuring and try to manipulate and increase the pressure, kind of like I talked about last week, trying to get my kids to call me master and all that. Right? You can pretend that you're not helpless. That's one of your options. But stop and think about that for just a minute. The opposite of helpless is what? It's responsible. If you're not helpless, then you are responsible. There's something you can and should be doing about this situation. God says to you and to me that we are dependent on him, and in many ways we're helpless. And so if I pretend that I am not helpless in one of these ways, then what I'm really trying to do is make myself responsible. Do you really want to be responsible for everything? I mean, I think we love the idea of being able to be in control of everything, but do you really want to be responsible for everything? Do you really want to be responsible for your own health? Do you really want to be responsible for predicting the future? Do you really want to be responsible for having the ability to change the mind and heart of your friends and your kids and your coworkers and fixing your country and everything? Do you really want to be responsible for everything? And another question goes right along with that. Would a loving God make us responsible for everything? Or would a loving God say, you know what? I'm going to make you human. And that means dependent on me. So there are things where you are completely responsible, and he lists those out for us in the Word of God. But he says, in everything else, you're going to be dependent on me because I'm going to be responsible for that, because I don't want to place that on you. That's way too much for you to bear. Pretending that we're not helpless sets us up for a world of anxiety and isolation and pressure and unnecessary suffering. Jonah, the guy who was famous for being swallowed by a big fish, while he's there in the fish, he prays this prayer and he says some things that are pretty amazing. One of them is this is Jonah 2 verse 8. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. The faithful love that he's referring to is God's faithful love. And that's what they're abandoning. They're abandoning the love that God has for them and the love that they could be experiencing. Why? Because they're cherishing, they're clinging to, they're hanging on with all their might to something that's an idol. Really, in the end, it's worthless, but they're refusing to let go of it. They're like, oh, it's mine, it's mine. Those who cling to the idol of independence and control abandon God's faithful love. They abandon the love that God has for them and the love that they could be experiencing. This is a crime against God, and it's a crime against their own humanity. So, but we could do it, right? Option one, we could pretend that we are not helpless, we're not dependent, and strive and work hard and try to make it all work. Option two, we could just resign ourselves and go, yep, you know what, I'm helpless, and give up. No. Option three, we could accept the invite. And you get an invitation, and the invitation is an option. It's an invitation. You're invited, but you get to choose. Am I going to go or not going to go? This is how I view what God's looking at you and me. And he's saying, hey, accept the invite. What? Okay, what invite? Life's invitations to pray. The invitation to embrace our humanity and our helplessness. They don't come printed on cardstock. They don't come through the mail. You don't RSVP. How do they come? Not printed on paper. They come as anxiety. They come as a situation that we could poetically describe as the valley of the shadow of death. They come as a recognition of a habit, a habitual way of responding that is not helpful at best and maybe sinful at worst. They come as an urge, a drive that's out of control and is hard to hold back. And when those things come, we can view them a couple different ways, like anxiety. Yeah, you find yourself being anxious. You can view it as a couple ways. You can view it as an irritation. Like, I hate wrestling with anxiety. And by the way, I'm right there. I do not like wrestling with anxiety. I don't like feeling anxious. Isn't a feeling I enjoy. So I can view it as an invitation or irritation, or I can view it as an invitation to something good. What's the something good? Oh, I'm feeling anxiety. Oh, that's my invitation to ask. It's my invitation to embrace the fact that I am human, I am dependent, I am helpless about some situation, but I can go ask my Father who is not helpless. It's an invitation. The valley of shadow of death, the experience that you're going through, for which it is just darkness and heaviness, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel to be seen right now. It's just pain. I can view that solely as an irritation, or I can view it as an invitation to something good, the invitation to go to my Father and say, God, I am asking you for the following. Number one, give me a keen awareness of your presence. Number two, do something about this. So am I saying don't pray? God, help me to beat my anxiety? No, I'm not saying that. I would encourage us to pray about anxiety. I'd encourage us to pray about the habitual responses we have that we realize that they're not healthy, they're not good, and they may be sinful. I'd encourage us to pray about the difficult situations we're in, but not to do what we so often do. To view them as the problem rather than as something that God is using to remove our delusions of control, of being more than human, so that we will ask, so that we'll receive. We're going to talk a lot more about ask and receive, but that, right? God is taking this thing, this challenging to us, like anxiety, like a struggle, like a difficult, painful situation. And he's using it. He's inviting you through that. He's inviting us to ask, and that is our reminder. Just like you set reminders maybe on your watch or on your phone, and it goes off, and you're like, oh, it's time to. Anxiety can be a reminder. Death can be a reminder. Harmful habits can be a reminder. Sinful urges can be a reminder. Even though they're all part of the curse, dependence is not part of the curse. And those things can be a reminder that I am dependent, and I can now go to the one that I am dependent upon. God is using elements of our brokenness to help us. And whatever helps us to recognize and admit our helplessness helps us. Now, it's easy to say, hard to do, especially if it's not your habit. For me, I struggle with accepting the invitation. When I get this kind of invitation, usually it's the form of anxiety. I just want to tear it up, throw it away, right? I know to accept the invite. I've learned that much. God has told me, Andy, that's what you're supposed to do. Treat anxiety as an invitation to embrace your humanity. But I haven't practiced it. I know this, but I haven't practiced it enough to make a habit of it yet. I'm going to read to you a journal entry from just a few weeks ago. This is what I wrote. I'm feeling helpless, and rather than it being my invitation to pray honest prayers to my Father, it's just fueling my anxiety and panic. Yeah. Then I thought, nope, Andy, you got a choice. You can live in this world of anxiety and just be anxious, or you can treat your anxiety as an invitation to embrace your helplessness, to embrace your humanity. And so a little later, I wrote this the same day in my journal. Father, I am helpless and human. I am dependent on you, but rather than embrace that, I have made a habit of pretending that I'm independent and then feeling victimized when reality interrupts my illusions. I'm human, made in the image of God to be the friend of God. I am human, not God. I am human, deeply loved and desired. I am human, helpless to control people, the weather, disease, my lifespan, events, future and past, bursts of creativity, lucky breaks, ultimate justice, and countless other things. I am human, royal and fragile. Then with that good dose of reality, the reminder that I'm human and all that that means, I asked God for several things. Oh, and by the way, it helped my anxiety too. But was that really the point? Honest prayer embraces our dependent status and lets our helplessness drive us to ask instead of to strive, pretend, or give up. Let's wrap this up. Friends, I don't know what you needed to hear today, but whatever it was, I hope you heard it. I hope you heard it. And I hope you'll hear it. Like you didn't just hear, you heard it, a minute ago or 10 minutes ago, or maybe it was in the first 5 minutes I was speaking. You didn't just hear it then, like, oh yeah, I heard it. But that you'll continue to hear it. You'll let God drive it in there. Because God loves you enough to speak to your heart, to invite you, to guide you, to correct you. I hope you heard what you needed to hear today, and I hope you'll hear it throughout this week. I look forward to being with you in part 3 of this series.